Cervantes, Leeds, and Manchester. Hispanglia seeks to explore the cultural relations between Spain and the United Kingdom, addressing a wide range of topics from film and literature to music and tonight, journalism in both countries. At a time of profound global change, examining how news is shaped and communicated is more pertinent than ever. We are privileged to be joined by two distinguished guests, experts who will offer the insights from both sides of the channel, from Spain and also from Britain. May I introduce Sam Jones? Welcome. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation. He studied English and Spanish at the university and spent a year teaching in Peru as part of his studies. Then he joined The Guardian as a trainee in 1999, and his career has spanned roles as a night reporter, night news editor, and assistant editor on the national desk before transitioning to general news and religious affairs. From 2014 to 2016, he served as The Guardian's global development correspondent, covering humanitarian crises such as the civil war in South Sudan and the aftermath of the 2015 Nepal earthquake. His journalistic work has taken him to more than 20 countries and territories around the world. Since 2016, Sam has been Madrid correspondent for The Guardian and The Observer, reporting on news, politics, culture, and environmental issues in both Spain and Portugal. Over the past 8 years, he has written extensively on a broad array of subjects related to Spanish society. Joining Sam this evening, we have, as usual, Professor Duncan Wheeler. I say as usual because he is the coordinator of this series. Duncan holds a BA and PhD from Oxford University and is currently a professor of Hispanic Studies at the University of Leeds. He serves as editor of the Modern Language Review and is a member of the Spanish Academy of Performing Arts. Duncan has been a visiting professor at prestigious institutions such as the Universidad Carlos III in Madrid, Oxford University, and UCLA. His significant publications include Golden Age Drama in Contemporary Spain, The Comedian on Page, Stage, and Screen, and Following Franco, Spanish Culture and Politics in Transition, a book that was launched in Cervantes Institute in Manchester. In addition to his academic work, Duncan is a regular contributor to media in both Spain and the United Kingdom, having written on politics and culture and several magazines and journals like The Economist, The Guardian, the London Review of Books, and the Times Literary Supplement, and many others. This evening, Sam Jones and Duncan Wheeler will engage in a discussion on journalistic practices in Spain and the United Kingdom. The conversation will explore what British readers find most intriguing about Spain, and conversely, what interests Spanish readers about the United Kingdom. They will also address how newspapers in both countries have engaged and adapted to the challenges posed by digital media, the declining sales of physical newspapers, and the broader threats to democracy and journalistic integrity and diversity, both domestically and internationally. At the conclusion of the dialogue, there will be an opportunity for all of you, for the audience, to participate in questions and answers, and that will be through our chat. So you are all very welcome to participate, to put your questions, and Duncan will speak to Sam. You will also be very welcome if you want to put the questions in Spanish or in English. And without further ado, muchísimas gracias y le paso la palabra a Duncan Wheeler.
Thank you so much. Gracias. Thank you, Pedro. And thank you very much to Sam for accepting this invitation, which is, it's actually been very nice because Sam and myself have had a correspondence by email and have done a couple of things together over the years, but we actually had never met in person until a couple of weeks ago, and we had a coffee to prepare this session. So it's a personal and professional delight to be able to do this. As Pedro said, what we'll do is we'll chat for around, normally we do kind of 50 minutes to an hour, and then we open the table up. I'm not sure we can open the virtual table up. I'm not sure if that metaphor works for anyone who wants to ask, questions in English, Spanish, whatever you feel most comfortable with. And what we're going to do is we're going to kind of move through the way I've thought about, structuring this was thinking about going through Sam's personal trajectory because, well, it's interesting in and of itself, but I think also it provides a route into seeing how the world of journalism and these relations between or perceptions of Spain and the UK have perhaps changed, or maybe some things have stayed the same over the last 25 years or so. So just to start us off, Sam, going back to beginnings, can you tell us something about how you first became interested in both Spain and journalism?
Sure. First of all, it's great to be here. Thank you very much for the invitation. And yeah, lovely to speak to you, Duncan, and to everyone else who's also joining the conversation. So Spain has always been a part of my life to one degree or another. My mum did Spanish at school, and she came and lived in Madrid for a few months when she was 19 in the early 60s. She was out for a visit recently, and the country's changed quite a lot since then, it's fair to say. But we always used to come out for holidays with my grandparents, and there is a distant Spanish ancestor on my mother's side as well. So it's always a place and a culture which just felt very familiar and very comfortable to me. I think that sort of rubbed off on me. At school, I did Spanish GCSE, I did Spanish A levels, I went on to read Spanish, at university. It just, opened up, another world, another way of looking at things. The terrific culture of Spain and of Latin America is something I've always, sort of found fascinating. So the Spain was already there. The sort of Spain interest was already there, sort of academically. And then when I lived in Peru as part of my third year of my course at university, I'd already done some journalism on one of the student papers at university. But I found that doing some journalism from when I was living in Peru was very different. It was a good way for me to kind of process my impressions of Peru, very different culture, very different country. And in a way, I think that helped me make sense of it. So, that became a nice marriage, shall we say, between my academic love of Spain, Spanish, Latin American culture, and actually being there and trying to convey, on the page, albeit of a student newspaper, what my impressions of that place were.
Which is almost like a kind of published diary of a certain sense of sort of you trying to make sense of your experiences for yourself and translate that for readers back in Oxford.
It was, yeah. I mean, I haven't looked at those cuttings for a long time. They're in a scrapbook buried in an attic somewhere, I think. But yeah, looking back, I think it'd be very personal because I was 20, 21 years old, living a very different life in a very different country. So yeah, I think it was definitely, my way of making sense of the country back then.
Oh, thank you. And one of the things we discovered actually when we had the coffee together, which we hadn't realised, is both of us did our first degrees at Wadham. We both read Spanish at Wadham College, Oxford, with the same tutor, in fact. And I mean, you said that you had Spanish, or the Spanish language was always Spain, and the Spanish language was always very present from day one, really, of your life. But looking back specifically on your undergraduate studies, can you highlight any aspects of the curriculum that particularly interested you? And perhaps did that influence you on where why you decided to go to Peru? I mean, Spain might have been a more obvious place, given that you say you had these prior connections.
Yeah, I mean, Spain was sort of the obvious choice, but I had a sort of growing hankering to go to Latin America. And I mean, one of the first texts we were set for the Spanish course was La Ciudad y los Perros by Vargas Llosa, the Time of the Hero, as it's called in English, which is quite a challenging book about a bunch of cadets at a military academy in Lima, and very sort of disjointed, sort of sub-Faulknerian text. But that sparked my interest in Lima as a place, and and how that society could be sort of so divided along sociological and sort of ethnic lines as well. And there were just other bits and pieces, like, the kids in the book in the Leoncio Prado, the academy, are drinking pisco. I was like, what's pisco? So I had a friend at college, and his big brother was doing his year out in Peru. So I got my friend who went to visit his brother to bring back a bottle of pisco so we could try it. And then as the time came to make the choice about where to go, I think my list of countries was Colombia, Peru, and Ecuador. And I ended up getting Peru, which would have been in about 1996, because I went in 1997. And I think almost as soon as the news came through, news came from Peru about the MRTA siege of the Japanese ambassador's residence in Lima, which obviously stretched on and became quite a famous siege. So that's what gave me pause for thought for a little while. But I was still very keen to get to Lima the following year, which I did in August of 1997.
Oh, brilliant. And of course, that would have been just a few years after that. I'm just thinking, because when did Vargas Llosa had his presidential bid in the early 90s, hadn't he?
1990,
So it was
yeah.
1990, yeah. So you then graduated in 1999, and this was still something of a golden age in print journalism. I mean, at that stage, did you have trepidation, enthusiasm about entering the profession? I mean, you started off as an intern in the Guardian. You've done pretty much your whole career at the Guardian, from what I understand. I mean, what was your sense as you were going into it? You were coming out of university and going into this job.
Yeah, I think it was both. It was excitement and a lot of trepidation, because it was, going into, a huge journalistic institution, and thinking, can I do this? Will I cut a, will I find a place? Will I find a niche? So yeah, it was very, very nerve-wracking. But I knew after the sort of student journalism and doing, filing pieces from Peru that got published in that student paper, that it's what I wanted to do. And luckily back then, in the very late 90s, so 1999, the Guardian had a kind of international news section, a sort of standalone magazine called The Editor, which used to round up the news from all around the world. And so I applied for a 2-week internship there, stressing I had Spanish. Back then I had good French, but my Spanish has displaced French from my brain. It's been a bit of a casualty, my French. So yeah, I managed to find, a way in. And he said, so, it's a very different time back then. Not everyone had realised the use of Google as a search engine. Other alternatives were available, and it was still very sort of tilted towards print, because obviously, that was still the way things were in the late 1990s. It was all about, circulation figures still, but you could see, away from the main building at that time, the Guardian, in a separate building, there was the Guardian Unlimited, which was the website that started up in the sort of mid-90s, which still had a very small staff, but there was a sense, and the Guardian was good on this, being a bit of an early adopter of the internet. There was a sense that that was the direction things were going to go in. So yeah, it was a really interesting time to join, because people were just starting to see that there was this alternative way of telling stories, an alternative way of reaching readers, particularly all around the world, and that offered huge possibilities if you knew how to, make the most of them.
Well, I remember, this is actually just an aside, but I was just suddenly thinking, I remember going to the talk when he became principal of Lady Margaret Hall, of Alan Rusbridger did the whole book, didn't he, on how the Guardian sort of did that digital transformation. And I guess I'm always struck when I'm abroad, this is a bit of an aside, but the Guardian's the sort of newspaper of, perhaps arguably the newspaper of record or reference in the international sphere, kind of out. While its circulation figures and its readership figures aren't as, in the UK, aren't as high as perhaps as some of the competitors, it's where it really makes it up is in that international digital space, which has been opened up and consolidated by the digital transformation.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that was a canny move by Alan to invest in the internet, and and the legacy of that is that you see, as you say, that global presence of the Guardian. We've got the London offices, we've got Sydney offices, we've got American offices, we've got Australian offices. So it's a properly 24-hour global news organisation, because when one day ends, it switches to the next desk. When their day ends, to the next one. So that there is a nice continuity and a constant provision of news.
Yeah, great. Well, I mean, we've kind of touched on this slightly, I mean, in relation to The Guardian, but thinking more about you, I mean, in a complicated period for journalism, your career, I mean, it's been exemplary, an increasingly rare success story. I mean, could you tell us something about how your trajectory went from that first internship to where you are now, and to what you attribute your success?
I think success is for others to judge. But yeah, it's been a fascinating time because I do feel I kind of straddle these two very different times. I remember sort of, when I joined, it was still the flow of the day was structured around the newspaper. There'd be a sort of lull, and then around 4 p.m. in the newsroom, you'd see people starting to get fidgety, thinking about, oh, I've got to start writing for edition, I've got to start filing. And that was the sort of tail end of the great Fleet Street sort of tradition where, supposedly people would go to the pub and have a few drinks at lunch and then, come back and file, all these brilliant stories. But that kind of culture was on the way out then. But certainly when I started, it did feel, things were changing. So, some of the older reporters would talk about, the sort of the good old days, the bad old days, depending on how you look at them, of, when you rushed out on a job and you didn't have mobile phones, because we're talking kind of 70s and 80s. So if the press pack had descended en masse on one place, everyone would look for the nearest phone. And there were tricks of rendering the phone useless for the next reporter to try and spike the competition that way, and of borrowing things from libraries. But even since I've been doing it, I remember going out on stories just with a pen and a notepad, and there used to be a really good service from Press Association, which was copy takers, where you would ring a number and you would read your copy down the phone.
Wow.
And it would be very, it would like sending a telegram. You would go, open quotes, comma, close quotes, new paragraph, full stop, new paragraph. And I was looking back, and I think I was doing that. That was in place until about 2007. And then, we started getting laptops, and there was Wi-Fi, and you could sort of work from anywhere and send from anywhere. And when I talk to younger reporters now, they're sort of absolutely dumbfounded at the idea that you would just go out with a pen and paper and you would bring copy in and somebody would type it up and then it would get to the newsroom. And I can, looking back, looking at it now, I can understand that does seem kind of antediluvian and a crazy way of doing things. But as you say, things have changed, dramatically. And it's sort of as a reporter, I'm lucky to have worked in different bits of the paper. So I sort of picked up different skills, and over the years, it's become apparent that the old sort of print skills of getting about and asking questions and writing are still fundamental, but they have to be complemented by other things. It's quite common today to find yourself, writing a live blog. So link sources across, trying to explain things. You need to know a little bit about video. There was a time when we were doing quite a lot of audio stuff, and we still do podcasts. So yeah, I mean, the transition from perhaps writing one story, two stories a day for print to servicing kind of different bits of the organization in terms of doing an hour's recording for a podcast or talking to video people, has changed quite a lot. That the workload has probably increased, but I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, because it does let us serve the reader better. It makes us better at our jobs because there are more ways of doing it.
And I guess you have to think about the different ways of addressing the readers and readerships. No, it's the kind of, I mean, that's what journalists have always been. It's what academics are hopefully getting better at, but haven't historically always been so good at, is thinking about who's actually going to be reading this and how they're going to digest this information.
Yeah. And what medium is going to best serve the story? Is this best done as a podcast? Is it a news story? Is it a news feature? Is it a very sort of colourful piece? Almost a complete feature? Video. Do we take a photograph for this? It's just constantly thinking about the best way to explain things, the best way to present the story.
No, thank you for that. And you've worked. I mean, we've talked about different periods. We've talked about different, section, different kind of formats within newspapers. But you've worked in both Latin America and Spain. Could you tell us something about the different opportunities and challenges that different territories and cultures pose? The difference between doing a story in Peru to Spain, or?
Yeah, I mean, the time I was working in Latin America was mainly when I was global development correspondent for those sort of 2 years. So I was doing a different kind of story at that time. So I did. I remember going to Bolivia and sort of going quite far upriver to go and talk to communities that had to relocate because of the climate emergency. They'd had terrible floods which washed the villages away. People nearly drowned, and you had wild animals and snakes being sort of washed across. So that's kind of one extreme of really going quite far for a story. Getting the plane to Rurrenabaque and then getting in a boat and doing it. And also doing stories on when I went to La Paz. I was very impressed with the cable car they've got from El Alto to La Paz. So I wanted to sort of write about that. And one of my colleagues who was working at an NGO there sort of knew someone and almost acted as my fixer and found somebody from the cable car company to come and talk to. So I could do that story while I was there. And other stuff, it was just taking a more general look. So I went to Haiti about 5 years after the quake, the quake was in 2010, just to see what life was like after that. And that can be quite a challenging place in some ways. But other stories would be sort of looking at sort of different cultural aspects of things, or how sort of underserved communities were finding sort of the challenges of life with the climate emergency. So I remember going to Ayaviri near Puno in Peru and talking to some alpaca farmers who'd seen all these terrible cold winters, and the baby alpacas were freezing to death. So doing that kind of stuff was a different kind of reporting to the stuff I do in Spain, which is home now, where I'll be where you bring contacts, or there's a press, or you drive out and go somewhere. So I mean they're two very different, but it's the same skills are involved. Finding the story, finding the right people to talk to, finding the right way to present it. But yeah, I mean two very different places.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. And I mean, as we've already mentioned, you've basically your whole career has been at The Guardian. Was that always the newspaper that you wanted to work for, or has it just been the way that things have panned out?
Yeah, I sort of had always wanted to say it, and the internship they did on the editor was a great way in. So I'm very happy, and I do. It's quite a good culture at The Guardian, and it's genuinely outward looking. It is interested. It is curious about the rest of the world, about places beyond the UK, beyond Europe, which I find stimulating, and that there is interest in other stories from different places, and the focus shifts, and things change, but that interest, that curiosity is a constant, which is really rewarding, because otherwise, if you find yourself focusing or being steered in the direction of the same thing again and again, it gets boring. It gets boring for me as a journalist. It gets boring for the reader, probably too.
So it's a global newspaper rather than a kind of newspaper with a few anecdotal global stories tagged on.
Yeah, no, I would hope so, and I think that's the mission, really.
Yeah, I mean, we've kind of perhaps covered most of the potential responses to my next question, but I'll still ask it just in case anything you want to add, which is, could you describe what you understand by the role of a foreign correspondent, and how the remit has changed, if indeed it has, over the course of the last 25 years?
So that's a good question. Big, almost existential. I mean, in a sense, there is something ridiculous about the concept of a foreign correspondent. You're having one person or two people who are charged with explaining an entire country or culture. So I would sort of see myself as a conduit for voices of people in that country, of experts in that country. So if I'm writing a story on a particular issue, I will want to go there. If it's about over tourism, I'd like to go to that area and talk to people and say, what's the feeling here? What are the issues? What's driving that feeling? And then talk to some people who work in the field, or some experts, and sort of gauge different views, and then present that. And it's a it feels, although everything sort of comes out under my byline, it is actually sort of behind the scenes quite collaborative. You know, I'm talking to people, I'm looking for different voices, I'm looking for different approaches, and you know, different ways of explaining things. So it's not just about, you know, politics. This happened today in Congreso. You know, the Prime Minister said this, the opposition said that. This bill is at this stage. You know, I'm looking at ways, and I think that the aim is to provide a sort of as big and integral a picture, as holistic a picture as possible of a country, which obviously has to go well beyond politics. It's got to get into culture, you know, and food and environment and, you know, pastimes. So, you know, the aim is to explain as fully as I can, you saw, with as much help from you know, people I might talk to in the street, or, you know, academics, or, you know, government ministers, whatever, to try and give an overall impression of, you know, what things are like. And, you know, and if an issue is a big issue, why is it a big issue? And is there a historical reason for that? Is there a cultural reason for that? So in a way, it's a, you know, it's a kind of translation.
I was going to say the words that came up to me from where you were just describing was kind of you're facilitating and filtering as the kind of
Yeah,
is the rule,
yeah,
is the
I
sort of
think
rule.
so. And you know, and I am, you know, I'm a foreign correspondent. I'm a reporter, so I am reporting. It is, you know, as it's told to me. Obviously, it's filtered through my subjectivity. You know, we're humans. It's bound to be. But the idea is to give voice and to explain. That's it. At the end of the day, I think.
I mean, the other thing that I thought was particularly interesting about what you've just said is when you say about, you know, it has to be more than just politics and things. That's something that's changed hugely with news. I mean, I remember speaking to John Hooper, I think was two before, he was a predecessor of yours, wasn't he, in the 80s, and his book, which I still use in class, is one of the best general books, The New Spaniards. I remember him saying actually a lot of that material was things that he was writing about when he was the correspondent in Spain. But at that time in the 80s and early 90s, it wasn't seen that a newspaper was, you know, the newspaper was necessarily a place for these stories about culture or about the life of a specific village, which perhaps now was more of a it's seen as more of a place for that beyond the kind of legal changes, political changes in what people ask of a newspaper and reporters.
Yeah, I think so. And I think that's been a very necessary and a very welcome change, because it's, yeah, you're only going to increase your understanding of a country and your knowledge of it by looking at the wider picture that goes, you know, sort of beyond politics. And yeah, I mean, that is a great book, and and you know, to mention another of my illustrious predecessors, you know, Giles Tremlett, whose book Goes to Spain, you know, takes almost, you know, a thematic approach to different things, to different parts of life in Spain, because, you know, it's fine, you know, a rigorous academic history of Spanish politics obviously has a huge place, but I think it's good to step back sometimes and see what drove those things and what the lingering influences of those things are, because they, you know, they echo beyond politics. And, you know, that's one of the things I like, is that I do have the freedom to you know, to choose what I write about and to go beyond politics, because I think it's more interesting for the reader, and, you know, it's certainly good for my sanity to have a wider range of things to look at and to report on.
Yeah, I mean, I'm about to not at all to contradict that, but I'm just thinking in terms of the actual going back to the idea of politics, which, you know, it's always going to be there, isn't it? It's just making that part of the package rather than the complete package. But I mean, in 2006, when you were appointed to your current role, Spain didn't necessarily seem as if it was going to be, you know, the most interesting posting at that point. But then there was the Catalan independence referendum, the rise of Vox, inconclusive elections, the fall of Juan Carlos, etc. Have you been surprised by quite what a hotspot for international news Spain has become over the last decade?
I have, yes. So yeah, 2016, when I came out here, summer of 2016, and, you know, one of the first tours I did was the day after Brexit, talking to people about that. But, you know, I didn't have any idea that it would be as much of a hotspot as it's proved about it. And I think, in my defence, probably not everyone did. You know, 2 years before, you'd had Juan Carlos abdicating, and then sort of 2015, you're seeing the rise of Podemos, and you're seeing Ciudadanos sort of come out of nowhere. And as you say, then, you know, 2017, you know, 5-6 weeks before the independence referendum, you've got the terrorist attacks on La Rambla and in Cambrils, and then that's the Catalonia became the dominant story for quite a few months, and at the height of it, there were three of us covering it. So that sort of showed you the importance it had come to assume in sort of global news, and from then on, it sort of hasn't really let up, but it's been fascinating to watch. As you say, the rise and fall of things, the rise and fall of Podemos. When it came out, in the June election of 2016, there was this idea of the sorpaso that Podemos
taking over from
socialists, and that didn't happen. And then, just before the vote of no confidence that Sanchez brought against Rajoy and his government in 2018, all the polls were saying, this is Ciudadanos is the kingmaker. If not, the next possible government. And I remember talking to Albert Rivera in his office in Congress a few days before the vote of no confidence. But as we all know, Ciudadanos jumped the other way, didn't back the vote of no confidence, and that was the beginning of the downward spiral into the current state of irrelevance that they're in. And then we've seen Podemos splinter and collapse. We've seen Vox, which was not given the time of day as a political movement, a few years ago, become the third biggest party in Congress. We've seen Juan Carlos go into exile. We've seen the Catalan amnesty. We've seen the pardons. It's been busy. It's been much busier than I expected.
There's the old cliche, isn't there? A week's a long time in politics, but actually in Spain over the last few years, I think it's definitely been shown time and time again that is the case, isn't it?
Yeah.
Absolutely. And could you describe what's your? You say it's been busy. But maybe this is a silly question, because to ask you what your average day is, maybe you don't have there isn't an average day. But what do you do on a Wednesday? If we were to take a guess on any given Wednesday, what Sam Jones is up to, what would be our safest bet?
So if my boss is on the call or not. No, it's hard to say what an average day is. If I'm in my office, then the day has a certain routine, it has a certain pattern, which is I get up, I read the newspapers, so I read, or have a very thorough skim of El País, El Mundo, ABC, La Vanguardia, El Periódico, El Diario.es, and then El Confidencial. I will look at other sites. I will check what's going on, with the Policía Nacional, with the Guardia Civil, see if anything's happening there. I'll read some regional papers maybe, and for good or for bad, part of my job is still having a look on the site formerly known as Twitter, to see what kind of conversations are going on there, because sometimes something can be sort of trending low, and then it can actually assume a big importance. And from then on, I'll put together an email list of, say maybe 3 things are going on today, and I'll send that to the news desk in London, and sooner or later they will get back to me saying, yeah, that sounds interesting, or maybe do that as a news story for today. That other one seems like it's worth plugging away at a bit of a longer term effort. Yeah. Maybe it's worth a reported piece. Maybe it's worth going to that place. And then, I'll see what happens once the day's developments. I'll start probably about 8:30 and probably clock off about 7 p.m. But that's the average day in the office. In recent weeks, I've been up in the Basque Country. I've been in Galicia. I've been in Portugal for the forest fires. So if it's that kind of day, I'll be traveling, and hopefully having set up as much as I can before I hit the ground. So I sort of briefed myself. So I arrived there, with a decent command of the situation at hand, and then talk to people to try and increase my understanding. Find voices, find the best way of explaining it. Sometimes there is a typical day. Sometimes the shape is completely knocked out of the sort of common routine, and occasionally I'll get pulled onto other things. If it's a really busy news day. I was doing live blogs for Ukraine after the atrocities of October the 7th. I was pulled into the Israel-Gaza coverage, and today I wrote a little bit about the death of Gustavo Gutierrez, the liberation theology. So it depends, and it's quite it can be a bit trying sometimes, but at the end of the day, I do appreciate that variety and the ability to sort of be able to write about different things and to be wide ranging and to be allowed to range quite widely.
I mean, there's something that you just said there that made me think. I mean, this isn't one of the questions I prepared, but what do you say about, the hitting, let's say, going to Galicia or to talk about fires or to speak to local people? Is there an example of a story where you've had a story in your head, or you thought the way the narrative of a story should be told was a certain way, and then you've gone and spoken to people and it's just been something completely different to what you had envisaged or expected?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's good. I think the trick is always to go in as open-minded as you can, and not really see the shape of the story or the thrust of the story
Until you've spoken.
Right, because otherwise you're going to, and maybe that doesn't always happen, but you don't want to be too coloured by preconceptions. And the best corrective for that, as you say, is going out and talking to people. And I think one of the big stories that's been reported over recent months, particularly by the UK press, is this sobreturismo, this massification, this sort of saturation of tourism, and it's been depicted as like a war on tourists and a war on tourism, and ungrateful Spain biting the hand that feeds it. And just going and talking to some of the people who have been protesting or whose lives have been changed or complicated a lot because of mass tourism is just really useful. I hadn't made my mind up, but just the idea of being on Ibiza and the wages being so low that basically your option is to share a flat for 2 people with 9 other people, and that's not a very pleasant way to live, and that it might be preferable to go and live in a tent or a caravan in a parking lot. And I spoke to a Guardia Civil officer in Ibiza who said, last year, a couple of the officers were sleeping in caravans or in vans because there is not enough housing. And one of the things for me, which was quite useful, was teasing out this idea of the consequences of over tourism. It's not just that people have suddenly said, this is not really working for us. It's not great. Let's do something about it. That's the product of years of frustrations. It's about precarious jobs, seasonal jobs. It's about a lack of housing. It's about not being listened to. And when all those things are bound up, they kind of explode. And the volcano from which they explode is the anti-tourism protests.
Yeah.
Just being able to go in depth and explain that a bit, though, I think is so useful.
Yeah, it's almost like from what you're saying, the anti-tourist protest, or however you want to phrase that, a kind of a symptom of much wider phenomenon. And I guess that provides you with, provides the journalist with a possible gateway into discussing other issues such as wages.
And I find that much more interesting, as something to write about than just saying 60,000 people took to the streets of Gran Canaria yesterday to pray together. It's like to explain that and to give people a sense of the frustrations and the underlying causes. I think that's kind of what it should all be about.
And I mean, I guess you've already talked about different kinds of stories you work on and different kind of timescales. That some are stories which you need to get out and that day, others you have a lead in. But you work for both the Guardian and the Observer, which are kind of I think it's fair to say they're kind of sister newspapers, aren't they? I mean, is there a difference between a kind of story that works for the Guardian and a kind of story that works for the Observer?
I mean, you sort of yes and no. Obviously, the Guardian, there's more pressure because it's a 6-day-a-week operation, with web deadlines and print deadlines. But the rhythm of the week works in such a way that sort of by Tuesday or Wednesday, the news desk in London will be thinking about the rest of the week, and particularly about the Saturday paper, which is the biggest paper of the week at the Guardian. All supplements, important for advertising. So it's a good meaty product. That Saturday paper. So thought will be going into that. So if I'm going to report something in more depth, I will normally sort of know by Tuesday or Wednesday, so I can. Hopefully by Tuesday, so I can set about, arranging things and getting up to the place, I need to be up at. So for last week, that was up in Guernica to write about the protests that have surrounded the plans for an extension of the Guggenheim Bilbao in the Abai Nature Reserve. But there are some stories that I think the Guardian, especially the Guardian, is a bit newsier. And what's good about the Observer is it's a little bit more stepped back. You can be a little bit more reflective about the things you write about and the way you write about them. So I like writing for both. And the good thing about the Observer is, often there's more space. It's a very good slot called the Special Report, which is about 2,500 words, which is great because all journalists want to write more. So that gives us a bit of freedom, and that's for me, I found that a really good way of explaining sort of some of the more in-depth issues. So some of the Observer special reports I did. So I did one was probably about 4 or 5 years ago about the sort of the Franco legacy and about why it was controversial, the idea to move him from the Bahía de los Caídos, and about how that had fed into contemporary Spanish politics and into that divide about we need to talk about this, we need to close the wounds, and those people saying don't open them, leave it alone. So having that space was really good. And similarly, I did a piece, I think, last year, 2022, about the kind of the legacy of ETA, pegged to the 25th anniversary of the murder of Miguel Ángel Blanco in the Basque Country, which obviously was one of the turning points that brought about the sort of the end of ETA, and having that space to do that, and to get up and to talk to people who've been victims of ETA's terrorism, or people who've been on the vigil while they're waiting for news of whether ETA had made good on its threat to kill Miguel Ángel Blanco, and explaining how that had, that still sweeps through Spanish politics. That the use of, we've seen particularly in recent days, the use of the legacy of ETA as a political tool, and there's just other stuff I like doing. So I did a piece last year about the 50th anniversary of the death of Lucha Reyes, who was an Afro-Peruvian singer who's not widely known, but who was hugely popular in her day, and who attracted a crowd of about 30,000 people to her funeral in Lima in 1973. And a Spanish record label just re-released one of her albums. So it's nice to have that kind of freedom, and the way to bring stories that may not be news enough always to make the cut, but which have a weight and an importance for me that I think are worth doing and worth showcasing.
I remember very kindly, about 8 years ago now, you did a nice feature on when I translated the Corin Tegal, who was the kind of the romance, sort of Barbara Cartland of Spanish.
Well, exactly, and a huge
best-selling writer of all time in the Spanish language, and published with now out of print, but sort of was instrumental to the sort of sentimental and education of millions of sort of women in Spain and Latin, well, predominantly women, but not exclusively, in Spain and Latin America. And you did a nice feature on that, which I was surprised, but very grateful that a British newspaper was able to find, scope and space for.
Well, I think that, as you say, her stage is incredibly prolific and, gigantic, sales figures, and you say an important part of people's lives. And that's not a story that would necessarily shout, report me, but it's a good way of explaining, society and that influence. And I think that's a useful way of explaining society and how people were and all that stuff. So I think it's always worthwhile doing that stuff, even if it's not razor sharp, grabby news.
It's great you've got that freedom. I mean, we've already talked about how at the beginning of a day you read the kind of major Spanish newspapers or look at them to see what stories might be out there. In terms of the Spanish media sphere, do you have personal and professional contacts? And do you see that's a different outlet to map on to, say, the Spanish Guardian or the Spanish Times, or is that too simplistic a way of looking at things?
No, I mean, I think you get. I do. Yeah, I mean, I've got some friends and contacts on Spanish newspapers and in Spanish media, who are always really helpful. It's quite a good mutual arrangement. Sometimes I'll need a quote, or I want to talk something through with one of them, and we do, and then they might need to pick my brains about something. So that works out really nicely. And yeah, I mean, you could crudely try and impose one paper on that. I mean, El País is kind of centre-left, Guardian-ish, but also clearly you've got El Diario.es, which is one of our partners. El Diario.es republished our foreign coverage translated into Spanish. You've got, tending towards the more right-wing end of things. Obviously, you've got, centre-right-ish El Mundo. You've got ABC. You sort of could, right? I mean, it's clear where the political divides are, but I'd hesitate to say something is the Spanish. I wouldn't say that is the Spanish equivalent of the Guardian. Yeah. That is the Spanish equivalent of Times. But broadly speaking, well, it's very obvious, broadly speaking, what the politics are of the big papers here, as obviously it is in the UK as well.
I think it's interesting, isn't it? Because I think correct me if I'm wrong on this, but historically, I think it'd be harder now, but El Mundo and El Guardian collaborated on certain investigative journalist projects back in the day when it's, El Mundo would now not be seen as a natural bedfellow for the Guardian, but they did have a very strong tradition at one stage of investigative journalism.
Well, absolutely, and it's they've done some of the best investigative work of any Spanish newspaper, El Mundo. Politically seismic stories. And very courageous, in-depth reporting. I think has been a service to the wider Spanish society. Yeah.
And one thing I was curious about, I mean, technically your job description is the Madrid correspondent, isn't it? And it's true that you live in Madrid, you're speaking to us from Madrid, but actually you do an awful lot of, you said you were in Guernica, you've done quite a lot of coverages, you do a lot of coverage of events from around the peninsula. I mean, we were talking when we met, we both kind of been to a slightly surprising exhibition of Renaissance art in Alba de Tormes, the home place. Oh, sorry, not the home place fee, where Santa Teresa spent a lot of her time, her professional life. Is that a deliberate strategy to move outside the capital and discover different stories?
Yeah, I mean the Madrid correspondent is just the job title. I could say Spain correspondent, but I think it's really important to get out of the burbuja as it is. With any kind of reporting, and I like traveling around. I like going to different bits of Spain. I like talking to to different people. Otherwise, I think it's very easy to fall into the trap of being in that Madrid bubble and filtering everything through Madrid. And I don't think that's a great service to readers. And it's not particularly interesting to see everything exclusively through that Madrid lens. So yeah, I mean, I do sort of make a conscious effort to travel around as much as I can, and to get to sort of underreported bits of Spain, because every bit of Spain has amazing stories to be told. It's just a matter of sort of getting out there and finding the right way to tell them. So yeah, it's a conscious decision. I do try and travel around as much as I can, and it's not a hardship to travel around Spain. So I always find something new and something exciting. So I'm not complaining.
Is it just a historic? I mean, it seemed counterintuitive to me. I mean, why you're not referred to as the Spanish correspondent, you're referred to as the Madrid. Is that just a kind of the way it's institutionally set up, or is it?
Yeah, it's just I mean, that's the dateline is Sam Jones in Madrid. It could say Sam Jones in Spain. I suppose technically I'm Spain and Portugal correspondent, but the shorthand has always been Madrid, Paris, Berlin, Rome, New York, wherever.
Oh, it's just the same for every country, and it's the same, yeah. And I often have the impression as a Hispanist, as an academic, that people in Spain either think I know way more than I do simply by virtue of being British, that this kind of gives me some privileged, intellectual gift that was given to me on birth, or that I'm completely ignorant as a foreigner. I think the boring truth's probably somewhere halfway in between. I'm just kind of bumbling along. Is that the same sort of impression you sometimes have as a journalist, that as kind of your opinions are either held in veneration or slightly dismissed?
Yeah, no, I think I've got no problem with bumbling along somewhere in the middle, like you. There's always interest when a foreign newspaper takes an interest in a particular facet of Spanish life or a particular event that's happening. And it does feel like occasionally we're accorded too much status. I'm just a reporter, but there's sometimes a sense that this is quite exciting that other countries are interested in us, which is sort of unnecessarily humble of Spain, because it's a fascinating place, and as we've talked about, some pretty momentous things have happened here over the past few years. So of course there's going to be a huge global interest, and yes, you're right. There is that tension between oh, the Guardian says this, and that sort of can occasionally be sort of blown up, for good or for bad. And other people are like, you're a foreigner, what do you know?
Yeah. So it's kind of...
who are you to judge? So yeah, the pendulum swings quite wildly, between those two extremes, depending on who the story suits, if you know what I mean.
Because I think you had the very controversial one, didn't you? You did a kind of, which didn't seem like it was going to be a major story, on meat production, which then kind of blew up out of all proportion, didn't it?
Yeah, no, I interviewed the Minister of Consumer Affairs, as was then Alberto Garzón, who said to me what he'd said to other people in the past, which is, we're eating too much meat, we need to reduce it for the sake of the planet and for the sake of our health. And he said, but if you do want to carry on eating meat, there are traditional options, extensive farming rather than intensive farming, which tends to produce meat of a lower quality. And yeah, all hell broke loose for about 2 weeks. And if a British minister said that, people said, well, okay, fine, whatever. But then it became quite a almost nationalistic argument about the sanctity of meat in Spanish society and ideas of disloyalty. And clearly, some people in the farming sector were worried about that. But who was worried? Was it the small farmers who farmers always have, or the middle farmers, or was it the huge sort of industrial farms? So yeah, it can, and there are other stories as well, which become sort of fun talking points. The classic, throwaway one is the Jamie Oliver recipe for putting chorizo in paella.
Yeah.
And then as soon as the British press started picking up on that, the Spanish press reporting on the British press reporting on that, and it snowballed into something, slightly crazy. But that kind of story, or if you get into the con cebollista, sin cebollista, Spanish omelette divide, there's passionate feelings on both sides of the aisle on that.
No, thank you. And I mean, we've kind of perhaps touched on this, but maybe we could sum it up or kind of take some conclusions from what we've been saying. I mean, what do you think it is about Spain, beyond the kind of individual incidents, we've mentioned? What is it about Spain that fascinates British readers so much? And why do you think Spaniards are so interested in how they're perceived from abroad?
I think Spain's a really familiar country in some respects to millions of British people, because it's a huge holiday destination for people, but mainly that's sort of the coasts and the more well-known areas. And I think people are interested to know what goes on a little bit beyond that. And there's more curiosity. You could almost probably do a map of people surging further inland over the past sort of couple of decades and getting to know Spain and its culture a bit more. And part of that is, there's a growing interest in Spanish food as a way of explaining Spanish culture and the popularity of Spanish food. People like Jose Pizarro, the Extremeño, who's now a big success in London, and is I suppose the voice, the face of Spanish food in the UK these days. You'll know better than I will. But I think there's long been a sort of fascination. I mean, I think going back centuries, there was the otherness of Spain, and what some people could talk about, the Leyenda Negra. This was a sort of dark and superstitious place, but then quite sensibly that's been binned, and people are more interested in this lively and vibrant sort of democracy, and which is quite a cultural force to be reckoned with. Look at the papers. Yesterday and today, they're all full of reviews of the new Almodovar film,
which is out on Friday, isn't it?
Yeah,
in the
exactly.
UK.
And in English. And I just think there's more of an interest as people want to go beyond the cliches, beyond all the yada rubbish, bullfighting, flamenco properly explained, bullfighting properly explained, great, but just to scratch the surface and repeat the old cliches, I don't think it's very worthwhile. And as to why people in Spain are surprised, I don't know. They shouldn't be surprised that there is interest, because it's a big, historically hugely important country that's had a fascinating and difficult history, and just to watch its evolution, I think over the past few decades, it's sort of absolutely intriguing. I think, you shouldn't be surprised that there is this interest, because it is, a fascinating place. No one goes. I don't think people in France or in Italy would go, well, why are people so interested in us? What is it? What do we have? But there seems to be sort of a long-held reticence in Spain, sort of being abandoned now, and accepting yes, actually people should be interested, and why wouldn't they?
Yeah. No, thank you for that. I think I'd agree. I mean, certain topics. I mean, this is a kind of, I guess this is a trade-off argument, which we've already talked about some of the strategies you've had, but certain topics clearly dominate the conversation, be that the effects of tourism or climate change in Spain. I mean, I guess there's a danger in the kind of technique that you, that you have of reading the newspapers, reading Twitter and things, of it becoming the conversation becoming actually narrower rather than wider, because everyone's repeating what everyone else is saying. I mean, you don't do that. So how do you strike that balance of engaging with the wider conversation but taking it into new directions, or maybe introducing stories into the conversation which aren't there when you're reading, that aren't getting the traction on Twitter or aren't being put in the newspapers that you're reading in the morning? What strategies are there for doing that?
That's a really good question. The trick is to find new ways, or quite often something could have been reported loads and loads, and you still feel, actually, no, that's not it. You're not quite, we're not quite there. It hasn't been made plain enough, hasn't been revealed or explained as much as it could be. And the good thing about my job is it's very much a two-way street. So I'm talking to the desk in London, and then midweek I'm talking to the Observer as well. And it's quite useful to have those phone calls with the desk, and they'll go, well, we've seen this, what do you think? And I'll go, yeah, that's right, or no, I don't agree with that. And sometimes out of that conversation will emerge a different way, of doing something. So, to go back to the over-tourism, everyone was doing, the beach protests and, people, outside sort of ayuntamientos, in the Baleares and in Canarias, protesting against all that. And it's like, well, what's the human sort of endpoint of this story? What are the effects? Which is why I ended up talking to people in the caravans, and talking to the police force about fears that it's harder for them to do their job because prices are so expensive, and so it's not really attractive for Guardia Civil officers from the mainland to go to Ibiza. Well, step back. What's that going to do to the society there? What are the young people going to do if they have got nowhere to live? They're going to leave. And so you realise if you strip it back a bit, it goes, as we said, it goes far beyond sort of over-tourism. So having those conversations with colleagues and just talking to people on the phone, talking to a hotel owner or somebody who works as a chef in a restaurant, that almost always opens up a new avenue, a new alleyway, a new way of thinking about things or looking at things.
It's just about finding the story behind the story.
Well, yeah, I think so. Yeah, basically.
No, thank you. And we talked about the digital turn quite a lot, but what about say, social media? I mean, how has social media changed what readers expect of journalists and foreign correspondents? And should you respond to how it's changed their expectations, or should you just carry on doing what you've always done?
We're far more accessible than we've ever been, which is good, because when I started out, the journalist was just the byline in black and white on a piece of printed paper, and I suppose you could, if you were wanted to get hold of them, you could pick up the phone and ask to be put through to them. But now it does feel like we're more contactable and sometimes more exposed. I'm always happy to deal with people who approach me politely, or on Twitter, or if they email me, whatever. If they're polite and respectful, even if they disagree vociferously and bitterly with what I've written, I'm very happy to talk it through. And again, that's helpful. Sometimes different point of view. Sometimes I go, oh, you didn't mention that, and I'll go, okay, well, right, yeah, I overlooked that. Thank you for pointing it out. And sometimes that can be genuinely useful. And some of the people who've written to me, in a moment of silent or not so silent fury in the past, I'm still in touch with, and and they say, well, have you thought about doing this, or is this on your radar? So again, it's about building the contacts, even if they spring from unlikely sources or strange conversations initially. But some of it is incredibly rude and offensive, and I wouldn't walk into someone's workplace I didn't know and berate them for not doing their job properly when I probably don't know how their job works. So yes, you've got to be, accountable and, open and transparent, but it's a two-way street. There has to be a bit of respect. I mean, I think it's very useful to have that direct conduit to the public through social media, through email or whatever. But that's not the feeling I have every day when people are being less than courteous, shall we say. And obviously the peak of that period was 2017, during the Capital Independence referendum, because that was really, to quote magazine, being shot by both sides, which was probably an indication that the job was being done okay, because both sides saying that's not right. Yeah, well, I'm explaining it as best I can. So yeah, accessibility is good, but like anything else, let's be polite and civil about it.
Yeah, so dialogue and respect. And just my final question, and then I can already see that we've had quite a few questions come up over the course of our conversation. I mean, what do you see as the most interesting news stories of the next few months in Spain?
Following through the political cycle, a lot is changing. It's still very shouty. It's still very angry. It's still very sort of personal, ad hominem. And seeing how what's going to happen with the budget, how Sanchez's government is going to carry on. It's been sort of counted out before, and people have shown it's not wise to underestimate Sanchez.
No, he's a great survivor.
So, exactly. And he's the manoeuvres that no one would think of or see coming seem to work for him. So seeing what happens with that, and also seeing if the Pepe can sort of keep its house in order enough. There's a lot of internal bickering. There's some strong personalities in the party, it's fair to say, and I think just sort of see politically what happens over the next sort of weeks and months. But I don't know. That said, there'll be surprises. It's important. I've given up trying to forecast or give predictions, because quite often they just don't work out because things change too quickly in a fashion that's completely unexpected.
So that's what we can anticipate, but we can also anticipate that things will turn out in a completely different way to we anticipate. I mean, I'm just looking at thank you so much for all those thoughtful responses. And I'm just looking at some of the questions. I'm just going to quickly, because Mia's written saying she arrived late, about how she was wondering about how you originally got your foot in the door with journalism. We did cover that, Mia, and actually because we talked about Sam basically worked on a student newspaper and then was an internship at The Guardian. But actually the conversation's been recorded and will be put on the Instituto Cervantes YouTube. So I suggest that what we do with that question is you go back and just look. I think that was in the kind of first 20 minutes. You'll find that information afterwards. I'm going to go in order of when the questions came in, because that seems to be the fairest way of doing it. And Anthony Gray says that something that struck him is that the Spanish news media, in both printed and both in terms of print journalism and television journalism, appears to be extremely focused on which Spanish politician and party is taking out denuncias against whom, be that last week with the Pepe versus the PSOE, or against individuals appointed to high-level posts who are generally associated with a specific party, accused of corruption or financial impropriety. And he says, although he knows we've had things about PPI and Partygate, etc. in the UK, this doesn't seem to be this level of obsessive or detailed scrutiny in the UK media compared to Spain. What are your views on that?
Well, I mean, it's so easy to open up a legal investigation, to flag something to a judge and to say, please, can you investigate this? That I'm very wary of jumping on the initial denuncia, because you don't know where it's going to lead. The judge could kick it out, and as that person rightly says, they're so commonplace and they're so easily triggered, and they're so political that you have to be, I think, quite wary and step back and let justice sort of take its course. And I guess I do sort of approach that in a way that fits my training, my reporting in the UK, which is you kind of wait for something to actually in court to see how it's going to play out, because once it's reached that stage, it is of importance and it is directly relevant. A lot of it is just noise. It's it's one-upmanship, it's score settling, it's ways of slinging mud. So, if I reported on the minutiae of every case that's, flagged to a judge, often which is just based on the reports to a judge could just be based on media reports.
Yeah.
There's, you don't have to prove that it's substantiated before you put it before a judge and hope they will open an investigation. If I did that, I would be writing about something every day, and probably 80% of that would lead nowhere.
I think it's all. I mean, I think just to pick up on a couple of things you said. I mean, it is the strategy, which actually is a strategy used in the US quite a lot, isn't it? That political opponents often accuse each other of something, not because they necessarily expect to win, but just because they think for the kind of the traction, the noise that will produce, will just create a general perception that the person's something there.
Well, it clogs up the news cycle, and it creates the appearance of something dodgy or something wrong, when that may not be. It may be the case. Perfectly well may not be the case.
Yeah.
But that is a sort of level where we're at. It feels in Spanish politics at the moment. There's a lot. There's more mud than policies being slung around. I think it's fair to say at the moment, and as has been the case for the last few years.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. I suppose the other dimension with it is how many appointments are political appointments, so that it wouldn't. So the presidency of Radio Televisión Española or of a national theatre generally changes when there's a change in government, which doesn't. There isn't that kind of arm's length principle, which kind of amplifies these political debates into other spheres. Yeah,
and it's often not very hard to trace the line between that denuncia and the media group it may have come from. It's in fairly plain sight often. Which side these are coming from and what the possible aim is, which is why I tend to treat them with caution until, as I say, they've reached they've got to reach that threshold for me, basically, before and occasionally there are times when that threshold is reached, as we saw with back with Pedro Sanchez in April, when he said, I've had enough of this. You're impugning my wife's reputation. This is a smear campaign. I'm going to go. I'm taking 5 days to go and think about my position. And clearly, if he hadn't done that, maybe it wouldn't have been as newsworthy. But again, that was one of Sanchez's sort of big moments, and he forced everyone to sort of look at it. And when we've got the Prime Minister saying, I'm taking 5 days off from public duties to go and consider this. Yes, we've reached a stage of that definitely being a story.
Yeah, which was, ended up working out as another one of his quite unexpected and unexpectedly successful strategies, I think, in many respects. But anyway, to move on to the next question from Amalia, and she wrote this in Spanish, but I'm actually going to sum it up very quickly in English. She's saying she lives in Valencia, and that there's there's been lots of English people that are living in Calpe, Benidorm, who, and many of them have come back to the UK because of Brexit. Is that a subject that you've dealt with in your reporting?
Yeah, I've sort of I've tried to follow the sort of big stages of Brexit and the process that followed. And especially when I came, the first couple of years, when I talked to anyone, if it was, the butcher, somebody, queuing for the sort of fruit and veg, if it was a plumber who's doing some work, ¿qué está pasando con el Brexit? They didn't, conceptually, people here didn't understand why people had voted in the UK to leave. And it continues to be a source of puzzlement. And it has, the new rules have changed, life for a lot of people who could, come out sort of all year round or thought they could retire here. But, the rules have changed, and, they're down to their allotted number of days a year. But again, although that's an interesting story in and of itself, and I do report on, the expat community, the migrant community, as we could also call it here. One of the dangers is seeing Spain through that expat lens, which is something I'm sort of keen, not to do. And that's almost one of the common tropes you see in UK journalism about Spain. Something happens, let's go talk to some Brits on the Costa. What are they going to say? Well, maybe I'll talk to Spanish people. And unless it's something that directly affects British people, I think it's more interesting to talk to Spanish people about what's going on in their country.
Controversial idea. There's another question from Anthony Gray, and he asked, he says there's a very visible Franco legacy in Murcia, the canal from Tajo to Segura. And there's also a structural water deficit through much, if not all, of the southeast of Spain, the impacts of which are amplified by climate change. And yet the north of Spain, in comparison, has perhaps an overabundance of water. Has this issue been treated in the media at all?
No, probably not enough. But that said, Catalonia has been in drought for more than 3 years. It's the hardest affected region in Spain when it comes to water shortages, and we saw some very strict rationing earlier this year, which has been rolled back since more rain has fallen, the reservoirs have fallen up, have filled up a little bit. But no, that I think that's a good question, and it's a very interesting issue. Is there enough water? And that is definitely one of the things. One of the stories that we're going to see more of, over the coming years. I've written about, a little bit sort of further south and further west, what's going on in Doñana. And I think for the third year in a row, the Lago Santa Olaya has dried up again, and it's becoming ever more acute and ever more visible. So yes, short answer, yes, probably more attention needs to be given to that story, but it is a story all across Spain and has been really, really bad, in Catalonia. But that story is not going away, regrettably, because of climate change, and things aren't going to get better. And one thing I probably should have mentioned is I find myself writing more and more about the environment in Spain, because it really does feel like the European country that is on the front line of things. Yeah. It becomes sort of more and more acute. Whether that's water shortages or forest fires, it's inescapable, and it's something something has to be reported, and will only be reported on more, I'm sorry to say.
No, as you say, it's I guess it's things we know in theory, but it's going to be the visual it's going to be the actual human fallout of that and the visual manifestations, isn't it? And I've got a question for them. I see nicely we got somebody putting their hand up, which means that you get a respite from my voice. Andrew Bibby has asked. He said he's got a technical question, which you may or may not know the answer to, Sam, about journalism in Catalonia and the fact that El Periódico and La Vanguardia produce 2 parallel editions each day, one in Catalan and one in Spanish. How do they do this? And he wonders if machine translations is used, but even so, presumably stories need subbing in each language. Do journalists write in just one of the languages? And he knows no other examples from the press around the world where this sort of thing is undertaken. I mean, I just said before, Sam's likely to know as much or more than me on this, but actually, I know a couple of people who write for La Vanguardia who don't speak Catalan, so there's definitely the capability for you to write in Castilian, and for it to be I don't know the exact technical process in which they use, but it's not that kind of people are necessarily providing copy in both. I don't know if you have anything to add to that, Sam, about.
That's a good question, which I haven't actually thought about. I'd probably refer you to La Vanguardia and to El Periódico about that, but I imagine it would be just translated quickly. I don't think they do machine translation. I don't know. It's a short. I'll be very truthful. I don't know, but it's a good question.
And I always find it very. You're right, and it is an anomalous situation. I'm not sure it's unique, but it's definitely anomalous. But I always find the slightly stranger one for me is always when I'm in Galicia and you read some of the newspapers there, which have stories in Castilian and stories in Galician. And I always find my level of Galician is frustrating, because it's enough that something can interest me with the headline, I can follow it, but then it's not enough that I can then actually understand them in minutiae. So I often find myself frustrated at seeing a story I'd want to read and get into, and then from my linguistic inadequacies, I'm not able to. Carl, you had your hand up before. Was there something you wanted to ask? It's now gone down, the hand. Oh no, he's coming up.
Yes, hi Duncan, hi Sam. I was asked to type my question. I was just doing that.
Oh,
if I'm on mic, can I ask Sam something?
Of course you can. Of course you can.
Sam, thanks very much. Listening to you, lots of memories from my own situation. You mentioned reciprocity, and I wonder, do you feel, as somebody who's got obviously a great love for Spain, thinks Spanish, there is a temptation to go native a little bit in that respect? It's often a comment levelled at foreign correspondents who are a long time in a country. Do you feel any pressure at all to report favourably from Spain's perspective on particularly sensitive issues? in return for that sort of access that you obviously have to many key figures? A very strange question, but it's something that people have commented to me before.
No, I think that's a really interesting question. I don't think that there is a danger of going native in inverted commas. Because as soon as I open my mouth in Spanish, people realise that I'm not in fact Spanish. The realisation doesn't take particularly long to strike, and I think it's quite a privileged position, sort of being in the culture, but not necessarily an integral part of that culture. I always feel I am, at one remove from things, but the question about, are you tempted to soften things for access? I mean, that's an issue that every journalist has to grapple with. Are you going to pull punches? And that sort of doesn't work as a long-term strategy, because if that happens, then you're perceived to be on a certain side, and that does your reputation damage over time. So I think being polite, but actually just reporting things as they are, as much as they are, has to be the first duty. And obviously all journalists are under pressure. Any journalist who writes about politics will talk to a politician, and if the politician's not happy, there will be phone calls afterwards, often at stupid hours in the morning, saying, what's this about? Why did you do it this way? And you go, well, those are the words that were spoken. I have a record of those words, and that's how I presented it. Do you disagree? Is there something factually wrong? So we always have to push back and defend, but that's an occupational hazard that happens everywhere. Lobby journalists in Westminster will get those phone calls at funny hours as well, with varying degrees of courtesy or rudeness. So it's something you have to deal with. It's for others to judge, but I think just trying to be as objective as possible has got to be the sort of the guiding light in all this, and talking to different people, talking to different parties, people with different points of view, to test them out a little bit and to give the reader a range of voices, so it's not all from one side, from one party, from one political perspective.
I mean, I was just thinking with what you were saying there, Sam. I mean, I'm just thinking about Carl's idea of, this problematic notion of going native. But I was thinking, as an academic, it's interesting going into the archives, because as often as what I realised quite early on was, if you go to the because of going back to this politicisation of institutions and often of individuals in Spain, I realised I was getting very well treated if it went into the archives of the Communist Party or the archives of the Francisco Franco Foundation, which holds some of his paperwork. I was treated very well, and I was wondering why. I was ruminating on beyond just hospitality of why I was, and I realised pretty quickly, but it's because people tend to work on the archives of the party that they're sympathetic to. So somebody who's a PSOE militant will often do a kind of PhD on a PSOE historical figure. And I think there's something about being, when you open your mouth and you're obviously not from Spain, such as myself, but it allows you, the sort of signifiers aren't so clear. So you can I can pass myself, not that I'm actively trying to pass myself off as a communist or a Francoist, but there's the question of doubt that I could be, but I'm not seen as necessarily an intruder when I go into those spaces, in the way that somebody of an opposing or different political view would be if they were Spanish. And I suspect correct me if I'm wrong, but I suspect there's an element of that in the journalistic labour as well.
No, absolutely. I think that's a really good parallel. That you're seen as somebody who's interested and may not be weighed down with ideological baggage. Which is useful. That said, obviously, given the Guardian's political leanings and its two centuries of history, some parties may be less sympathetic to a phone call from me than they would be from another paper. But that's obvious. That's going to happen anywhere in any country with any newspaper with a particular point of view, and any political party with a particular set of policies, or history. But I think, there is a kind of privileged position to being an academic, as you say, or to be a journalist, because you're kind of welcomed in. But that goes back to the idea of people sort of being interested in sharing, and maybe thinking that it's not been explained sufficiently, in the past.
Yeah, well, thank you. We got a question here from Katrina, who's saying, regarding the issue of climate change in Spain, what's your observation, Sam, to the view of, or what's your sense of Spanish people's view of green energy? She's asking us, she's surprised that there currently doesn't seem to be a similar uptake of electric and hybrid cars in Spain compared with the UK.
Yeah, that's, I mean, sort of anecdotally, when I walk around, I'm seeing probably more electric cars, but they tend to be quite high-end cars in Madrid by people who can afford, and they're electric BMW, whatever, the sort of glide with that almost silent hum, down the streets. Well, I'm seeing a lot more, anecdotally again, I'm seeing a lot more solar panels, go on roofs. And I think there is a growing awareness, and there isn't that negacionista thing that you get in other countries. I think most Spanish people accept, because they can see it with their own eyes, that it's pretty plain that things are changing, and that could be from people in Madrid who saying this weather is not right for this time of year, or it's hotter than it should be at this time of year, or it's colder than it should be at this time of year, or talking to olive farmers in Andalusia saying my family's been doing this for 3 generations and we've never had such low yield. So I think it's fairly inescapable, and maybe more needs to happen. I mean, under this government, there's been quite a push, from Teresa Ribera, the environment minister, who's off to the European Commission soon. I think there's a growing awareness, and I think people are very receptive. But yeah, it seems to be taking a while. But then you get big forest fires. And I did a story, I think last year, I went up near Zamora, and there was a terrible fire there, and some images that became quite famous of a guy trying to clear the flames from around town in his digger. And there was a video of him just there's black smoke, then the digger was sort of engulfed by flames, and then he jumped out and he ran, and you could see that his clothes were on fire. He was an incredibly brave man called Angel. Sadly, he died of his injuries a few months later. But I went up the town a year later to say, what had changed, and people saying, it didn't used to be like this. Land use has changed, and there was an acceptance there. There was the tremendous sorrow for the loss of Angel, but there was a recognition that this is happening. And I see that it's very rare for me to talk to anyone in Spain who goes, eso no existe. Everyone can see that it is going on. But yeah, more could be done, but showing a country where more couldn't be done, I guess.
I mean, I was just thinking conversely, but a lot of Spaniards have been it depends a lot in the UK. It's kind of a certain lottery of local authorities, but quite a lot of Spaniards who I've known who've come to the UK have been quite shocked by kind of how bad some of the recycling systems of certain councils are. I'm just thinking in my block of flats of how it works. It's I'm pretty sure it's illegal according to definitely according to some European, and I suspect according to some national legislation. But there's kind of that's just something that strikes me that in Spain it's been the recycling thing has been taken up with quite a lot of, generally, I mean there'll be exceptions, has been taken up with quite a lot of enthusiasm and with not much kickback really. I mean, again, that's anecdotal on my part, and maybe people may tell
we could probably do another hour on like bin collections in Spain versus bins in the UK, because when I tell friends and family in the UK that they come and get the bins every day, the general rubbish bin and the plastic recycling, and there's the brown wheelie bins for organics and garden waste, and that gets picked up practically every day. People are absolutely aghast. Okay, we have to go down, but glass bottles and cardboard in the bins down the road. But yes, this is very different, and it seems to be quite enthusiastic in terms of recycling.
Thank you. I mean, we're coming towards the end of our allotted time, but if anyone's got a final question I would like to pose to Sam while we're lucky enough to have him here, then that would be great. Or we can just all go off and have our dinners.
Yes, well, Sam, you mentioned at the very beginning and several times about the importance of food to understand culture. Living in Spain after quite a few years now, would you recommend not a dish, because there are many, but maybe a book about the Spanish food that you would recommend the audience, the British that are interested in food, but also in discovering Spain through our gastronomy?
It's going to feel like I'm shilling for publishing firms now. I guess I mentioned Jose Pizarro, who I think is very good. Claudia Roden wrote a good book on Spanish food a couple of years ago. Claudia Roden's also written very interesting about the recipes, the Sephardic recipes of the Jews who took their cuisine to other countries after they were expelled in 1492. So yeah, I would say Jose Pizarro and Claudia Roden in terms of books for English readers. They're very easy to read, and the recipes are good, which is always a good thing in a recipe book.
I mean, just as an aside, I think there's probably a PhD in, or maybe it's already been done, but I inherited from a friend who's sort of sorting out their mother's book collection, kind of Spanish cookbooks from the 1950s and 60s, and it's fascinating about both how cuisine changes, how perceptions of cuisine changes, and also how what conclusions we draw from what people eat and drink. As it's often the books I thought the English books about Spanish cuisine from the 50s and 60s I thought probably told us more about England of the 1950s and 60s than it did actually about Spain of that period. And we've just had a couple of final questions, which we'll do. Is Clarissa's just asked what advice you give to future journalists and correspondents?
That's a good question. Read as much as you can. Travel if you can. Talk to people. Yeah, I think that curiosity I think is essential. You've got to be interested in people and interested in why things happen. I don't know what stage you're at, but the sort of classic thing is at university to write. Having languages, I suppose that's the kind of the foundation for this entire event and for the Instituto Cervantes. But the importance of having languages, because it is a cliche, but it's true. It does break down barriers. It does introduce you to new cultures and new experiences and new people, and it forces you to think in a different way because you don't. Sometimes you have to reach for the word, so you're thinking in a different way. Your brain is sort of following different pathways, so it gives you a different perspective. And and to go back to the beginning, that year I spent in Peru, 1997-98, was hugely formative, living in a very different place, and eating very different food. To bring it back to food, it's had such a massive impact on me. Maybe that year sowed the seeds for my coming to live in another country. Maybe there was a certain inevitability about it, even when I was 21. I don't know, but your chances are increased so much if you do have another language, and if you are lucky enough to be able to travel and to talk to different people and to find out about different cultures.
Well, I'd second that completely. So it's also, I always think it's a shame, when often young people aren't encouraged to study languages and things. I mean, I just think about anecdotally, my supervisor's son's been very successful very quickly at football journalism, and one of the reasons for that one, he knows a lot about football, but actually is because he had different languages. He was able to speak to some quite top players in their own languages, and often when they moved clubs perhaps were feeling a bit lonely or homesick and liked having, and that kind of just opened so many doorways, both personally and I think professionally to him. Val has also pitched in that she also likes Rick Stein, Spain. I mean, I think just as the final question we have from Carl again, who just says about how do you decide to pitch to a news desk as a timeless, not a current affair story, e.g. the wine heist feature? You
just know. Some stories. So yeah, I mean the wine heist feature, which I forgot to mention, but yeah, that was a lot of reporting. But crudely it ticked all the boxes.
It was a great story, wasn't it? So this was about, for people who don't know, it's about a kind of couple who went to a very good restaurant, in fact, in Extremadura.
Absolutely, yeah, in Cáceres. And they booked in, this 3 Michelin starred restaurant with a wine cellar of about 40,000 bottles, maybe more than that. And then the next day, the couple had left at dawn, and they found that 1.3 million euros worth of wine had been taken, including a very rare bottle of 1905, 1906 Chateau Yquem. and that had, you know, that had all the ingredients. You know, it's a bit of a mystery. It's a courtroom drama. It's a bit of Spain. It's Extremadura, so it's not the obvious place. It's not like Madrid. It's not Barcelona. It's not, you know, a place that's hugely well known. It's just really compelling. But yeah, I mean, that story took a lot. That took, you know, months and months of work, and, you know, me working during my holidays. You know, it's a bit of a labour of love when you get a story like that and you want to sort of do it justice. And what, you know, you're sort of helpless in the face of that. You sort of get a bit, this is going to sound weird, but you sort of get infected by the story, and you know the only way to get out of your system is to try and do as much justice as you can and to report it as well as you can. And there's just a big sense of relief once, you know, you delivered the thing, you know, to the world. And that some those stories, you just sort of get possessed by them without sounding extraordinarily weird, which I probably do.
But then that was sorry, then I really will wind up. But it was interesting, that story, because you doing that, I then think, talking about widening the conversation, is I then actually did a couple of pieces for the one for New European and one on for Art Monthly on the restaurant and its links to the growing arts scene in. There's an amazing gallery being opened in Cáceres, which was large. It's a very long and convoluted, but the owner of the restaurant, which the wine got taken from, was instrumental in brokering that. So actually, by putting that restaurant on and the story on the radar, which done with less skill could have been quite easily a kind of, you know, it was great, it was this heist caper, but it could have been done in a more sensational style. In fact, it wasn't. Then actually allowed this conversation to be moved to different places and in different directions.
Yeah, and just that story was about two guys from, you know, a poor and fairly forgotten Spain who set up a restaurant which has triumphed against, you know, sort of many odds. And it was also, you know, it was a love story. It was about one guy's love for wine and history and for all it represents. I mean, it was a massive tick in the box. You know, from a sort of narrative point of view, it was you know, irresistible. And they were so great that people, you know, everyone I spoke to for that story was really.
So where's a restaurant worth going? And the I don't know whether you met the waiter at the, so I can't remember whether he's the maitre d' or what that role is, but he was at the Ritz before. He used to serve Margaret Thatcher, so you can go there and be served by the same person who can tell you stories about what a lady she was. And apparently Rod Stewart was very nice as well in the Ritz. That was, that was my stories I remember him telling me. On that note, I think we should probably bring it to a close there, but thanks ever so much for everybody who came, and especially to Sam for giving so generously of his time and his wisdom. And I hope everyone's enjoyed it as much as I have. And we'll be back on, it's December the 11th. We have a completely different guest, but also an Englishman living in Madrid, or an Anglo-Irishman, I should say, living in the Greater Madrid area, who's Richard Dunwoody, who was one of the major, one of the leading British sportsmen of his generation in the 80s, and has now dedicated himself to photography and life coaching in Madrid. In Spain more generally, but based in Madrid. So thank you to everybody, and hopefully see some of you next time.
Muchas gracias. Thank you, Sam. Thank you, Duncan. It was fantastic. We have been almost 2 hours, yeah? So the topic was such an interesting thing. And yes, we hope to see all of you on the 11th of December. Muchas gracias.
Gracias. Adiós.
Yes.
Adiós.